When my parents stole the 100 grand I'd saved since I was 17, I didn't feel rage, not at first. Instead, I felt strangely numb. I stood in my cramped apartment in Albany, staring at the empty coffee canister where the fake stash had been hidden. Rain pelted the grimy window, streaking down like oily tears. I listened to the wind howl along Clinton Avenue, shaking the branches of the half-dead trees outside. That night, even the city itself seemed tired of betrayal. My name's Mike. I'm 43, single, and I repair appliances for a living. It's not glamorous, but I'm good at it. And since I was a teenager, I quietly put away almost every spare cent, determined not to end up like my family. Always desperate, always short on luck and cash. But now, staring into the empty hiding spot, I felt like the biggest fool in Albany. My mom, dad, and my younger brother Jason had always struggled with honesty. Still, even after every lie and disappointment, some naive part of me believed that family would never really cross the ultimate line. Until they did. Jason was always the charming one, the one everybody liked despite his screw-ups. His latest scheme, opening a car dealership with shady partners, blew up spectacularly. He owed serious money to dangerous people. My parents panicked, and suddenly my hard-earned savings looked like Jason's easiest way out. But here's the twist. I knew they'd come. I knew they'd snoop around, tempted by the money they thought I had hidden. So, years ago, I'd set up a decoy. A fake stash, 100 grand, enough to make them believe they'd hit gold. They had no idea about the other account, holding nearly 400,000. Every dollar earned honestly, sweating through summer afternoons, fixing washing machines and refrigerators. My dad called, voice heavy with fake sympathy. Jason was in trouble, they said, as if that justified stealing from me. Mom wept on cue, crying about family obligations. Jason had messed up again, and now his life depended on it. They'd pay it all back someday. I pretended to be shocked, played the role of a betrayed son perfectly. But inside, I was calm, calculating, because I'd been ready for this exact scenario. I'd gathered evidence meticulously, banking statements, recordings of phone calls, proof of their lies and theft. Now it was time to strike back, not out of rage, but simple justice. My brother's shady business, my parents' self-righteous facade, it was all about to come tumbling down. They thought they destroyed my future to save Jason, but they only destroyed themselves. After that rainy night in Albany, everything changed. For the first few days, my parents and Jason thought they'd gotten away clean. I let them believe it. But deep inside, my quiet numbness hardened into something else. Cold determination. I grew up in Albany, and though it's not a big city, it's easy to disappear into a crowd, especially for someone like me. Average height, thinning hair, and clothes that blend into the background. Nobody notices a repairman unless something goes wrong, and that's exactly how I'd live my life. Unnoticed, careful, invisible. But now, I had a different plan. I kept working like usual, driving my van through neighborhoods lined with rundown houses and overgrown yards, fixing dishwashers and dryers for folks barely scraping by. And as I fixed their problems, I thought about mine. The trust I'd lost, the family I'd never really had. My parents had always favored Jason, excusing his messes as bad luck, while calling my quiet independence coldness. When I was 16, I overheard my mother telling a neighbor that Jason was the child who made her feel like a mother, and I was the one who felt like work. It hurt so deeply that I never let anyone close again. Not really. I built a wall, brick by brick, made of money and quiet solitude. And now they'd torn down even that. Each evening after work, I'd carefully compile the evidence I gathered over the years. Recorded phone calls, text messages where my parents openly talked about taking my savings, even social media posts from Jason bragging about new business opportunities. My lawyer said the case was airtight. All I needed was patience. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal during family dinners. Sundays were the worst. I'd sit at their table in Colony, eating Mom's dry roast chicken, listening as they praised Jason's new start. I'd smile and nod, hiding disgust beneath a polite mask. But inside, the anger simmered, bubbling quietly beneath my skin. Then one evening, something broke inside me. Mom mentioned casually that my savings helped Jason avoid something dangerous, implying I'd done the right thing by losing everything I'd worked for. In that moment, sitting at their worn-out dinner table, anger finally overtook numbness. I looked around the faded wallpaper and chipped dishes, symbols of their constant bad choices, and realized they dragged me down too. My silence made me complicit. I'd never confronted them, never told them how I really felt. I'd let resentment quietly define my entire life. That evening, alone in my tiny apartment again, I made a promise to myself. No more quiet sacrifices. No more letting them take everything good from me. The next day, I filed a lawsuit. Albany's gossip mills would soon have fresh stories to grind, and this time, my family wouldn't escape untouched. Once the papers were filed, it felt like I'd finally crossed a bridge I could never turn back from. News travels fast in Albany, especially when it involves money, betrayal, and family drama. Within days, people I barely knew would pause on sidewalks to give me knowing nods or curious glances. It was uncomfortable, but strangely satisfying. For once, I wasn't invisible. The thing is, I wasn't seeking revenge. Not exactly. I just needed justice. All those years spent quietly living beneath my family's shadow had taught me something important. Sometimes the only way to be heard is to make noise, even if it shakes everything apart. My brother Jason panicked first, predictably. He called and texted relentlessly, playing victim, begging me to reconsider. He argued it wasn't really theft because family money should belong to everyone. But family money meant my money, apparently. I ignored his calls, letting his panic feed my resolve. My parents took a different approach. They resorted to the usual tactics of guilt and shame, calling me selfish, cruel, and worse. It was nothing I hadn't heard before, but it still hurt. I'd spent a lifetime trying not to disappoint them, hoping my quiet strength and financial independence would somehow win their respect. Instead, they'd always resented me for being different, for making them look weak. Soon, Jason's business started collapsing publicly, just as I'd anticipated. Customers fled, partners distanced themselves, and his carefully crafted facade crumbled. Suddenly, he wasn't charming or clever anymore, just desperate and pathetic. I watched from afar, not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. This was justice, plain and simple. Albany, meanwhile, was changing seasons. Winter came early that year, cold winds blowing harshly through the streets. Snow dusted the sidewalks and piled in muddy drifts along Central Avenue. The city felt gray, tired, and hardened, just like me. As I walked those familiar streets, bundled in my old jacket, I knew people were whispering, but it no longer bothered me. They didn't know my pain, my sacrifices, or how deeply betrayal could scar. One evening, alone again, I stood in my kitchen making coffee when I caught sight of myself reflected in the dark window. The man staring back wasn't exactly someone I recognized. He looked older, harder, worn down by secrets and silence. But beneath all that, there was something new, determination. I finally stood up for myself. For once, I'd refused to be a quiet victim. But here's the truth. Winning didn't feel good, not the way I expected. Destroying Jason's business, humiliating my parents, it didn't erase my loneliness. It didn't fill the void they'd carved out in me over decades. I'd started this fight wanting justice, wanting them to understand my pain. Yet, now that the wheels were turning, I felt emptier than ever. Maybe that's the hardest part about betrayal. It doesn't just break trust. It breaks something deeper inside you, something harder to fix. As snow quietly fell outside my window, I wondered if justice was worth the price I was paying. Things escalated quickly. Once lawyers and courts got involved, family dinners stopped happening. Though in truth, they'd always been more about appearances than warmth. Jason had vanished from public view, probably hiding from creditors and old business partners he betrayed. My parents became invisible, holed up behind drawn curtains in their small colony home. I drove past their house once, on a bitterly cold January afternoon. Snow was piled high, dirty from traffic and neglect. The lawn that Dad once proudly kept trimmed was now wild, patches of dead grass poking through ice and mud. Seeing that neglect stirred something inside me. It reminded me that even though I'd won, I hadn't escaped unharmed. My lawyer told me to avoid contact. Everything was ammunition now. But curiosity got the better of me, and I drove by Jason's dealership. The parking lot was empty except for a few abandoned cars, rusting quietly beneath a heavy layer of ice. A once glossy sign advertising Wilson Brothers Automotive dangled half-broken, letters faded and smeared. It was strange how quickly pride could decay. I wondered if Jason finally understood what it felt like to lose everything you'd worked for. Probably not. People like him never truly learn. They just move from one disaster to another, pulling others down with them. But as weeks passed, I realized I'd underestimated the emotional cost of revenge. I was still fixing refrigerators, still coming home to a dark apartment, still eating microwaved meals alone. Justice hadn't magically healed the scars of betrayal or loneliness. Instead, it carved deeper ones. Sometimes, when the city was quiet, I'd catch myself replaying family memories, the rare good times that made everything else harder. I remembered one Christmas when Jason and I were kids. We got matching bikes, bright blue with shiny chrome. It was the only gift my parents ever gave us equally. For once, I felt included, hopeful. Now that memory just felt bitter. Around that time, Jason sent a message through a mutual acquaintance. He wanted to meet, claimed he had something important to say. I hesitated. Was this another manipulation, another trap? Or had he finally realized something important? I agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. As I sat waiting, staring out at dirty slush lining the sidewalk, anxiety twisted in my gut. Would he show regret, beg forgiveness, or just feed me another sob story? Minutes passed. Half an hour later, Jason still hadn't shown up. I paid for my untouched coffee and walked out, embarrassed and angry. Even now, he couldn't respect me enough to face me. But on the walk home, I finally understood what I'd really been chasing all along: acknowledgement. I just wanted anyone, to say they understood my pain, that my sacrifices mattered. In the weeks after Jason stood me up, I buried myself in work, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. Each day blurred into the next, an endless cycle of broken refrigerators and leaky washers. My hands were always scraped, knuckles cracked from the cold, but the physical pain helped dull the ache inside me. Albany remained wrapped in winter, the coldest I could remember. People hurried along icy sidewalks, bundled in scarves, eyes fixed downward. Nobody had time to notice me now, and, strangely, I missed the attention. I'd gotten used to whispers, glances, even pity. It was better than being invisible again. One afternoon, while fixing a furnace in a rundown apartment near Arbor Hill, I overheard neighbors gossiping about my family. They whispered how my parents had become reclusive, ashamed to show their faces after what they'd done. At first, the words felt satisfying, proof that justice had reached its target. But soon I just felt sick. Did I really want my parents hiding from their own community, humiliated and isolated? As flawed as they were, part of me still wanted their love, their acceptance. Maybe that was the cruelest trick of all. Even betrayed, I couldn't stop longing for family. I began taking long drives after work, wandering aimlessly around Albany's outskirts, Colony, Loudonville, Bethlehem, trying to sort my tangled thoughts. I'd park my van at empty strip malls or vacant lots, staring at snow-covered fields stretching out beneath gray skies. These quiet spaces became the only places I felt honest with myself. One evening, parked near a frozen pond outside Colony, I thought about Jason. Had he always planned to betray me? Or was he just so desperate he couldn't see any other way out? Was there ever a moment he'd considered me, even briefly? The questions burned because deep down I knew the answers. That night, restless in bed, I remembered the first day I'd hidden money away, 17 and filled with hope. I'd promised myself I'd build a life different from my family's, a life where honesty mattered, where love wasn't measured in debt or obligation. Yet somehow, years later, I'd ended up just as isolated, just as broken. It was a bitter realization. I'd fought so hard not to become like them, yet now I felt more alone than ever. Revenge hadn't fixed me. It only revealed how damaged I already was. Lying awake, listening to Albany's distant hum, I finally admitted something I'd refused to acknowledge before. I was scared, not of Jason or my parents, not even of loneliness. I was scared I'd never be able to trust anyone again, that betrayal had changed me permanently. I got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, and filled a glass with water. In the pale glow of streetlights filtering through the window, I knew something had to change. Revenge had served its purpose, but it was costing me too much. It was time to let go, not for them, but for me. I couldn't forgive them yet, maybe never would, but I could stop letting their betrayal define who I was. Tomorrow, I'd start making peace, not with my family, but with myself. Letting go turned out to be a messy process, far messier than revenge. At first, I wasn't sure where to begin. Forgiving wasn't really an option yet, but moving forward meant accepting that some things couldn't be fixed, only endured. I started small, reorganizing my apartment, throwing out reminders of my bitterness, old letters, family photos I'd kept hidden, even furniture I'd never liked. Each piece tossed into the dumpster behind my building felt like dropping a heavy weight off my back. But letting go emotionally wasn't as simple. One day, while cleaning out a closet, I stumbled upon a worn box labeled Jason. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were old baseball cards, a broken toy car, and a dusty photo from a summer trip we'd taken as kids to Lake George. Jason smiled broadly into the camera, one arm slung carelessly around my shoulder. He looked genuinely happy, carefree in a way I'd forgotten. My chest tightened painfully. I'd spent so long painting Jason as the villain in my story that I'd forgotten we'd once been brothers. Real brothers, not just rivals. We'd once shared secrets and late-night talks about dreams we never admitted to anyone else. That realization hurt more than betrayal itself. Albany thawed slowly, as if winter hesitated to release its grip. Days turned milder, snow melting into muddy puddles along Washington Avenue. People seemed friendlier, or maybe I just noticed them more now. I made myself get outside more often, visited new places in town I'd never bother exploring. Sometimes, after finishing a job, I'd take a long walk along the Hudson River, letting its slow, steady flow soothe my tangled mind. Yet, even as I tried to move forward, thoughts of my family lingered. News trickled in through acquaintances. Jason had left town, probably fleeing debts or shame. My parents had finally put their house up for sale. I felt a brief surge of satisfaction at first, followed quickly by sadness. Their failures weren't really my victories, just more loss. One afternoon, my lawyer called to say the lawsuit was settled. It had cost my family dearly. Money they didn't have, reputations that couldn't be repaired. I hung up feeling hollow. Justice was served, yet there was no triumph, no sense of closure, only emptiness. Spring arrived late, but vivid. Albany transformed almost overnight. Waking from winter's slumber, sidewalks cleared of slush, trees burst into soft greens, and for the first time in months, sunlight felt warm against my skin. I'd started living differently, choosing small changes deliberately. I visited new cafes, talked to strangers at work, even went out with colleagues a few times after repairs. It wasn't easy. Being sociable still felt strange after a lifetime of staying hidden. But slowly, Albany began to feel like home again, this time on my terms. My parents finally sold their house, and I heard through the grapevine they'd moved into a cramped apartment in Schenectady. Part of me felt bad, yet another part knew this was their doing, not mine. Jason was gone completely. Nobody knew exactly where, though rumors had him in Florida, chasing new schemes and old mistakes. I finally bought my own house. Not the fancy place I'd once imagined, but a modest bungalow in Del Mar, just outside Albany. It was comfortable, quiet, and mine, earned solely by hard work, untouched by deception. The day I moved in, I stood alone on the porch, keys clenched in my hand, feeling an unfamiliar sense of pride. I spent evenings working on the house, painting walls, fixing cabinets, planting flowers out front. Each improvement was personal, a small step forward. My neighbors were friendly, and though they probably knew bits of my story, they never brought it up. I appreciated their quiet kindness more than they knew. One Sunday morning, a letter arrived in the mailbox, my mother's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a simple note. She didn't ask for forgiveness or defend what she'd done. She just wrote she hoped I was happy, that I deserved better than I'd gotten from him. Reading her words, something loosened in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a quiet peace I hadn't expected. It made me realize something important. Maybe they'd never change, but I didn't have to carry their burdens anymore. Soon after, on a mild Saturday evening, I hosted a small barbecue. A few coworkers came, and some neighbors joined as well. Standing in my backyard, laughter filling the air, I felt unexpectedly happy. I watched faces lit softly by fading sunlight, felt connections forming around me, gentle and genuine. For the first time in years, loneliness seemed distant, like an old ache finally healing. Later, as guests left and I tidied the yard, I paused beneath the clear, starry sky. The night was cool, the air sweet with the smell of fresh grass. I realized something I'd missed all along. Real success wasn't revenge or money. It was finding peace in your own skin. For too long, I lived my life defined by betrayal and loss. Now, standing quietly beneath the open sky, I understood I could choose something different, acceptance. And in that moment, beneath a gentle Albany sky, I finally felt free. Freedom, it turned out, brought its own quiet challenges. It wasn't the dramatic tension of betrayal or revenge, but the subtler trials of learning to trust again, to risk connecting with others after years spent carefully alone. Summer came warmly, filling Del Mar streets with the scent of lilacs and fresh-cut grass. Neighbors walked dogs at twilight. Children raced bicycles down shaded sidewalks. My house settled comfortably into routine. Coffee on the porch in the mornings, evenings spent tending my small garden, repairing old furniture, or reading quietly. Yet something inside me still hesitated. Trust felt like standing on thin ice, fragile and unfamiliar. But I was determined to keep trying, knowing the alternative was an isolation I'd already endured far too long. Gradually, I built new friendships. There was Joe from work, easygoing and patient, who invited me out for beers at local breweries. And Elena, my neighbor, a retired teacher who left baskets of fresh tomatoes on my porch, always smiling gently without intrusion. Their kindness taught me something vital. Not everyone expected something in return. Some people were simply good. One afternoon, as I painted the fence, Elena paused on her way home from the store. She mentioned how peaceful my garden looked, saying it reminded her of healing, something she needed after her own hardships. I didn't ask, but recognized in her eyes the quiet depth of someone who'd lived through their own losses. That evening, reflecting alone under the dimming sky, I understood more clearly than ever. Healing wasn't linear. Some days felt peaceful, others raw with lingering pain. But each was a step away from my past towards something new. My parents never reached out again, and Jason remained a distant rumor. I heard he'd gotten into trouble down in Florida, his habits unchanged. I wished him no harm, though I felt no urge to help. We'd chosen our paths, and for once, mine felt honest. Then came another surprise. Returning home from work, I found a voicemail waiting. It was from Lisa, an old classmate from high school, someone I hadn't seen in decades. She'd heard through friends about what I'd gone through and wondered if I'd like to meet up sometime, catch up over coffee. At first, suspicion flared automatically. But something made me pause, remember Elena's quiet wisdom, Joe's casual kindness. Maybe this was another step forward, another test in trusting again. So I called her back. The conversation flowed easily, as if time had barely passed. We agreed to meet downtown at a cafe near Washington Park, familiar but neutral territory. On the day we met, Albany felt vibrant, alive beneath a cloudless sky. Waiting at a sidewalk table, my nerves twisted in anticipation. Not fear, but hopeful uncertainty. Then Lisa appeared, smiling genuinely as she approached. In that moment, something loosened within me, another tiny knot of distrust slipping quietly away. Sitting together, sharing stories from our separate pasts, I laughed openly for the first time in ages. And as we talked, I realized the quiet, stubborn truth I'd ignored for years. Life wasn't meant to be lived alone. The more I spent time with Lisa, the clearer life became. Not easier, exactly, but simpler in a comforting way. We didn't rush into anything serious. Both of us had our share of old scars. Instead, we learned slowly about each other, trading stories about high school memories, jobs, dreams we'd shelved along the way. With Lisa, each conversation felt like a gentle unraveling of tightly wound strings inside my chest. Late summer turned golden. Evenings grew soft and warm, perfect for walks in Washington Park or quiet dinners at home. I began feeling something I'd forgotten existed. Genuine happiness, uncomplicated and free of suspicion. One evening, as we walked slowly along the river, Lisa asked about my family. Not prying, just gently curious. Normally, I'd tend to the question, but this time, I took a breath and told her the truth. The betrayal, the hidden savings, my own painful revenge. Lisa listened quietly, her gaze understanding without pity. When I finished, she didn't tell me I'd done the right thing or reassure me with empty words. She simply squeezed my hand, quietly acknowledging my hurt. Her silent acceptance was exactly what I needed. No judgment, just empathy. After that night, my past began feeling further away, less of a shadow following me everywhere. Each day brought more clarity, like clouds lifting after a long, stormy season. I kept working, kept building friendships, slowly understanding that trust didn't mean vulnerability to betrayal, but courage to risk again. But life wasn't without surprises. One morning, Lisa and I stopped by the weekend farmers market downtown. Sunlight warmed the air, stalls bursting with fresh vegetables, pastries, and handmade crafts. Then, unexpectedly, I saw them, my parents, older now, standing quietly by a fruit stand. They looked tired, diminished somehow. My heart froze. Lisa noticed immediately, following my gaze. She gently asked if I wanted to leave. But instead, I took a deep breath, realizing I felt stronger than I'd ever been. I approached them cautiously. For a long moment, we just looked at each other in silence. Then my mother spoke softly, her voice uncertain, asking how I'd been. There was no bitterness, no pleading, just quiet regret. My father said little, shifting awkwardly, but the look in his eyes revealed his own sadness, his quiet shame. I saw in them the consequences of their choices, their own punishment more effective than any revenge I'd ever sought. I told them I was doing okay, that life was finally good. They nodded quietly, relief in their eyes mingled with pain. No apologies were spoken, none asked for. Somehow, we'd moved beyond needing words. Walking away with Lisa afterward, something lifted inside me. A heavy weight I'd carried so long, I'd almost forgotten it was there. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was acceptance of what couldn't be changed and embracing what could. That afternoon, sitting quietly in my yard, Lisa beside me, Albany's warm sun softening around us, I realized life was about these small moments, the ability to sit peacefully, scars and all, knowing you'd survived. In that quiet understanding, beneath the gentle late summer sky, I felt whole again.